In today's tutorial, I'm going to be looking at the box model. Firstly, I'll answer the question, what is the box model? Then I'm going to talk about the constituent parts of the model and show you how to use them to build websites. Finally, I'm going to look at the main differences between three kinds of boxes: block boxes, inline boxes, and inline block boxes. So firstly, what is the box model? Basically, everything in HTML, everything on websites is a box. Anytime you code out a HTML tag, a H1 tag, a P tag, an image tag, a div tag, what you're doing basically is creating boxes, and then you're stacking them on top of and inside other boxes. So if we just glance quickly over at my current homepage for the Written Nerd, you'll see that some of the HTML elements are being outlined: logo, navbar, headers, code blocks, all based on the box model. And you can see there the final outline was the HTML box, which is outlined in yellow, and that basically acts like a container for all the other boxes. You may already be familiar with this diagram of the box model. Most browser dev tools have an interactive version of it to help with web development. So what we'll do now is to quickly run through each element and outline its function on a web page. So the innermost blue layer represents the size of your content. If it was, for example, a H1, this would be the size of the writing. The next layer is padding, and this is used to add space around the content of your element. Then comes the border, which just frames your element if you choose to include one. And finally, the outmost layer is the margin. When you define a margin, this is basically space created between the element and adjacent elements to push those elements away. So if you define a margin of 20 pixels, any adjacent elements will be removed from the edges of that element by 20 pixels. There are some tricky cases with margins where they can collapse in certain situations, but we'll look into that shortly. So let's jump over quickly to the text editor. As you can see, I've already set up two H1 headings, box 1 and box 2. I've given them a background color and I've given them a white font. The other thing I've done is I've zeroed out the margin of the page using the universal selector here, and that's just because certain browsers add a default margin to the page and we want a level playing field to really see the box model in action. So if we skip over now to the browser, you can see what this looks like so far. So we have two boxes, different background colors. So when it comes to different kinds of boxes, I want to point out that H1s are block level boxes, and two of the defining features of these is that they cause line breaks before and after themselves, and they also fill the width of the space that they take up. So at no point did we define a width, and yet the background color stretches the full width of the browser. So now the first thing we'll do is actually just switch back to our text editor and we'll set some explicit height and width properties. We'll set a height to 100 pixels and we'll set the width to 200 pixels. And we're going to just copy and paste these. We're going to set both boxes equally the same height and width. So now let's pop back over and see that. So there we have it. We have 200 pixels wide and 100 pixels height, but because they're block level, they don't sit next to each other. They still cause a line break, even though the width is now explicitly defined. So we'll pop back over to our text editor, and now we're going to write in some of those box model elements. So we'll start with padding, and I'm going to give them both 50 pixels of padding, and we'll give them a 10 pixel border, say it's solid and black. And then we'll give them both a margin of 20 pixels. And I'm going to, again, copy and paste this so both boxes are identical, just, except for the colors, obviously. So save that, pop back over, refresh the page, and there we have. So let's actually open up the DevTools and inspect what we've done. So if we click over, hover over class 1, box 1, and look over here, we can actually hover over the middle and we can see that 200 by 100, that's the explicit width and height that we defined, and you can see that highlighted there. Then we go out to the padding, 50 pixel padding, you can see it highlighted, and that's not 50, that's 50 pixels all around. So it's 50 pixels top, left, bottom and right padding. Then you've got a 10 pixel border, which you can see there in black, and then you have a 20 pixel margin, which you'll see highlighted here. And remember when I mentioned collapsing margins, so this is the interesting thing. If you look at the margin for box 1, it actually goes right down to the edge of the border for box 2. But then if we hover over box 2 and look at the margin, the top margin goes right up to the border of box 1, and that's what I mean when I said collapsing margins. Between the two boxes, if you set a 20 pixel margin on both boxes, you would expect there to be 40 pixels of space, but instead there's only 20 pixels of space. And it's important to remember that these apply to vertical margins on block level elements. Inline elements or inline block elements are not affected by collapsing vertical margins. So quickly, just to illustrate this, we can just skip back over here to box 1, and we'll turn one of our boxes into display inline block. Save it, go back to the browser, refresh the page, and there you see we have our full margin. So if we hover over box 2, you can see that there's 20 pixel margin, and then box 1 also has a 20 pixel margin, and they have not collapsed into each other because box 1 is now an inline block. But before we talk about inline elements, let's quickly go back over to our diagram here and look at what's happening to the width and height of our element. We set the width and height to be 200 by 100, but if you scroll down here you can see the real width and height is now 320 by 220, and that's because the default behavior is to add the padding and the borders to the width and height set, which can be a real pain when you're trying to lay out elements because you have to take the padding and borders into account, but there is a way around it. So if we quickly switch back to our editor, what we're going to do is we're going to define a property on box 1 called box sizing. Now the default is content box, so that's currently what's applied to box 1 and 2, but we're going to switch that to border box and click back into our browser and refresh the page, and as you can see box 1 has instantly gotten smaller. So what's happened? Well, border box takes the padding and the border into account when it's sizing the elements. So here it's now got a size of 200, which is what we set, by 120, which is 20 pixels more than what we set. We set the height to be 100, but that's because when you add up the 50 pixels of padding on the bottom and the 50 pixels of padding on the top, you already have 100 plus 10 and 10 of border makes 120. So if you add more height in your padding and your border than you actually set in your width, and then you use box sizing, it will be slightly larger than what you explicitly set. So we can quickly switch back over and fix that just by making the height slightly bigger. So we'll just change the height there to 150, save it out, go back to our browser, refresh the page, and now you can see that it is exactly what we set it to be because the border and padding is no longer greater than the height we set. So what it's done now is it's taken the border and the padding, which is 120, and because we set it to be 150, it's added 30 height to the actual content. Now this is a lot easier to lay out content using border box than it is the original, the default, which is content box. So it's quite common to set box sizing border box, not just in the element that you want, but in the universal selector at the top. So then it automatically applies to any elements that you want to size. So here's just a quick summary about what we know about block level elements. They force line breaks, they don't sit next to each other on a page, they take up the full width of the browser if you don't set a determined width, but you can set explicit width and heights on these elements, and as we've seen, their vertical margins collapse, and the larger of two margins will win. So if you have a top margin of 30 pixels and bottom margin of 20 pixels, the space between the two elements will not be 50 pixels, it'll be 30 pixels. And they're just some examples of default block level elements. So just to run through some of the characteristics of inline elements. They don't force line breaks, they only take up their own width of space in the browser window, and because of that they can sit next to each other. The whole point of an inline element is that it flows with the page. And because of that, obviously, you can't add height to the top or bottom margins or top and bottom padding. You can add the padding and the margins, but they just have no effect on surrounding top or bottom elements. You also cannot set explicit widths or heights on these elements, and some examples of default inline elements are A tags, hyperlink tags, span tags, and labels. So if we go back into our text editor, you can see that I've already coded in two hyperlink tags, two A tags, both default to inline elements. So if we go over here, I've given them a font size of 30 pixels, one of them has a background color pink, one of them has a background color of green, and that's all I've done. So we'll switch over to the browser and have a quick look at them, and there we have them. This is an inline element, and so is this, and you see them, they sit by default, they sit next to each other on the page. They don't take up the full width of the page, and their width and height is determined by the font size. That's it. So let's go back over to our text editor and have a look at some of those characteristics. So the first one is, we've seen they don't force a line break. They sit next to each other. Let's try and add some height and width now to the first inline element. We'll say, let's try and give it a height of 100 pixels. And let's try and give it a width of 400 pixels and see what happens. So we'll switch back over, refresh the page, and nothing changes because you can't explicitly set height and width to inline elements. So we'll go back to our text editor and let's see what happens when we try and set top and bottom margins and padding. So we'll start with, say, a margin, and we'll just do a margin all around of 10 pixels. And then we'll add some padding, and we'll add all around padding of 20 pixels, for example. So that's just on the first one. Let's switch over to the browser again, refresh the page and see what happens. Okay, so if we go to inspect element here and we click on the first inline element there, we can see that the margin and the padding has been applied. It's just having absolutely no effect on the adjacent, the boxes above and below it. But the margin is having an effect horizontally. So it is pushing it away from this side of the page and it's pushing away the other inline element. So let's switch back to the text editor now and we'll try something else. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the second A tag here and I'm going to cut it and I'm going to put it under the box. And I'm going to apply the exact same styles, so height, width, margin, padding, to both A tags. So they are identical except for the color, and we'll save that and we'll go back and just double check. There we go, right? Now, to illustrate inline block, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just change, I'm going to show you first of all that the default setting for hyperlinks is inline. I'm going to put display inline just to show you that that is the case. We go back here, reset the page, and it doesn't change because that is the default setting. So now we'll go back and we're going to change inline 2 to display inline block to see the difference in the two of them. So we'll switch back over to the browser, refresh the page. So inline hasn't changed. Basically the margin is there, but it's having no effect on either box. And we scroll down, we can see that inline block, the margin and the padding, and actually both margins. So the box's margin you can see there is having an effect, and the inline margin is also having an effect. And that is the major difference between inline and inline block elements. Inline elements, those top and bottom margins do not have an effect. Inline block elements, those top and bottom margin and paddings do have an effect on the elements surrounding them. And not only that, you can tell that the width and height have also changed. So you see here, even if we make it a little bit more explicit, let's go here and we have a look at this height. Let's add 250 pixels to the height and scroll down, and you can see that that has taken effect. Whereas if we go up to inline 1 and we come in here, you can actually see Nightly is really useful. It's showing us by graying these out that the height has no effect on this element since it has a display of inline. So it won't even let you try and change. I mean, you can go in here and probably put in 200 pixels, enter, makes absolutely no difference because you can't change the width and the height on inline elements. So just quickly, 2 points to summarize inline block. You can set a width and a height, and the top and bottom margins and paddings do have an effect on surrounding content. So now quickly to summarize, we've looked at the box model itself. We've seen how websites are made up of elements that are boxes. We've looked at the constituent parts of those boxes, their content, their paddings, their borders and margins. We've seen 3 outer display types: block level elements, inline elements, and inline block elements. And we've seen how they differ from each other and the effect that has on a web page. Now these are outer display types because, as we've seen, their properties determine how the box sits in the flow of the page. What we haven't looked at are the inner display types such as flexbox and grid. And their remit is all about what goes on inside the boxes, how elements sit in the flow of a box. But that's for another day. You should see now that the reason the box model is so important is that it basically forms the basis of all layout on the web. And that wraps up our tutorial. I hope that's been useful to you, and please subscribe below if you want to see more.